An author named Chris Cotton and his students take a trip to the ghost town of Teardrop to write. But when strange things start happening in Teardrop, they realize this abandoned town holds secrets they can't escape. Chris is a mystery novelist who also teaches a high school writing class. One day, he takes his fellow teacher Rebecca and 3 young Authors Club students, Ross, Josie, and Tila, with him on a field trip to a town called Teardrop. He thinks it will be a good exercise for the students and himself to find some writing inspiration. It's a far-flung area that's hard to reach, but eventually they make it to the old deserted western town. When they arrive, they check into the only hotel in town. There, they meet the receptionist and saloon bartender, Denver. Denver takes a moment to look at Chris as if he recognizes him, but Chris tells him he's never been to Teardrop before. Denver tells the group that the hotel is almost fully booked, which is strange because the place seems so quiet and empty. All that's available is one room and the hanging judge's cabin. The group decides that the 3 girls will take the cabin, while Chris and Ross stay in the remaining hotel room. They take the room keys and leave the lobby to get settled, but Denver quietly warns Chris that Teardrop should just be a pit stop, not a destination. Chris brushes this advice off. While getting settled in their room, Ross and Chris see a maid in the hotel. Ross approaches the young woman and asks if she can answer some questions about the town. They'd like to learn more about Teardrop from a local. However, the maid says she's not supposed to talk to customers and leaves. That evening, Chris and Rebecca have a drink at the saloon. Apart from them and Denver, the place is empty. Chris decides to interview Denver about Teardrop. The bartender tells his guests the story of why the town is named Teardrop. Many years ago, there was a little girl named Lorelai who lived in the town. Lorelai was a little strange for a girl her age. She kept to herself and her toys, and rarely spoke to others or showed emotions. Legend says she never even cried. Because the other kids couldn't understand why Lorelai acted the way she did, they teased and beat her. But still, she did not shed a single tear. Denver also tells them that the photo hanging at the hotel entrance is a portrait of Lorelai and her mother, Alice. In the hotel room, Ross and Josie convince Tila to get high with them for the first time. They eat some edibles that Ross brought and explore the hotel. Outside one of the rooms, they hear voices and the sound of a vase breaking. But when they go into the room, there are no people. There are just 2 scarecrows on the bed and a broken vase on the floor. The students are spooked, but convince themselves the wind just knocked the vase over. Back at the saloon, Chris tells Rebecca he feels like Teardrop is bringing out his creativity. Just a few hours spent in town, and he already loves it. He also confides that his last book was rejected by his publisher, which is why he's even more fired up to write something compelling on this field trip. The 2 exchange banter and flirt a little. But when Chris goes in to kiss Rebecca, she rejects him. She tells him if they are to become a couple, she wants to take it slow. The students leave the hotel to explore the town. They come across a big barn and hear a child humming inside. Curious, they enter the barn, but once they're inside, the humming stops. They hear a low growling and see a hound with glowing eyes at the other side of the barn. They all run out of the barn frightened and run into their teachers. They tell them what they saw, but Chris goes inside to inspect and finds the barn empty. He realizes the 3 students are high and lets them off on a warning. The following day, Chris experiences a migraine and flashes of pain. Once the pain stops, he starts to take voice notes for his next book and talks about their first night. Later on, Denver gives the group a tour of the town. He tells them the story of the hanging judge's cabin. The cabin used to belong to Judge Wincott, the man responsible for several of the town's public hangings. The most horrific of them all was the hanging of his wife, Alice. Before her passing, Alice warned them all that they would pay for what they did to her, and that no one will ever leave this place. As Denver tells this story, he gives Chris a knowing look, as if it's something he's already heard before. Chris asks Denver why the judge hanged his wife, but he doesn't answer. More flashes of pain affect Chris, and he gets very quick visions. It is unclear to him what is in these visions, but they definitely have something to do with Teardrop. That afternoon, Ross sees the maid again outside the hotel. Taking an interest in this young woman, Ross asks her questions about herself and life in Teardrop. The maid tells him she has never left the town before. Denver spots them talking from afar and yells at the maid to go inside. Meanwhile, Rebecca gets a strange feeling about the town as she's walking and hears hounds in the distance. She tells Chris she wants to go home, but Chris refuses to leave. He's on fire with his writing. Annoyed, she tells him he can stay there and they'll go back home without him. Chris tells his fellow teacher that it's not just the book that's making him stay. Years ago, he found something in his grandfather's basement, a letter written in this very hotel. Chris has been looking for this hotel for several years now. Rebecca reads the letter. It was written by Alice, addressed to her son. Chris thinks that Alice is his great-grandmother, and that she sent her baby away before she cursed Teardrop. That baby, according to Chris, was his grandfather. The fact that this was apparently a personal trip for Chris angers Rebecca. He didn't need to get her and the students involved in this. But when Chris pleads that he needs to be in Teardrop to uncover family history, she agrees to stay. Once Chris is alone, the migraine and visions come back. In his hotel room, he finds an old newspaper article about the hanging judge. Somewhere around town, Tila wanders off alone. She sees a large tree with her name carved on the trunk with blood. When she holds her hands up to her face, her fingers are bloodied as well. Tila looks up and sees a noose hanging from the tree. The rest of the group realizes Tila is gone when they all meet up at the saloon, but she doesn't show. Chris rushes to find her. When he does, Tila is freaking out. The blood and rope disappear. He takes her back to safety. In the evening, Chris and Rebecca spend time at the saloon again. He shows her some of what he's written so far, and she says it's fantastic. Denver is at the bar as usual, and Chris asks him again why the judge hung Alice. Denver agrees to tell them the story, as long as Chris doesn't quote him in his book. Judge Wincott was a man with no empathy, Denver tells them. Not only criminals feared him, even his own family was afraid of what he could do. By the time his daughter Lorelai was 8 years old, he had grown to hate her and her abnormality. He was disgusted by his own daughter, and this hatred consumed him. Unable to bear the rage any longer, he beat her, but still Lorelai did not cry. He suffocated his daughter with a pillow, and ended up putting the blame on Alice. No one dared question the judge, and Alice was hanged for a crime she did not commit. Chris then asked Denver if Alice's baby survived. Denver answers that Chris is living proof. From the moment Chris walked into the saloon on their first day, Denver instantly knew he was related to the Wincotts because he looked exactly like the judge. In the cabin, Josie notices that there are self-harm scars on Tila's wrist. She assures Tila that she'll listen if she wants to open up. Tila admits that ever since they arrived, she's been having weird thoughts, and it's scaring her. Meanwhile, Ross wanders into the town's cemetery area, reading the names on the graves. Because he's drunk, he walks around carelessly. The maid arrives and warns him to be more careful about stepping on the graves. He apologizes, and the two talk more. Ross takes a real interest in this girl. They talk about what it's like to be young, and what it would be like to be old. Playfully, she runs away and calls after Ross to catch her. While looking for the maid, Ross sees an old man by a tree. The old man turns to him with frightening white eyes. Shocked, Ross backs away and falls down, hitting his head on the ground. He crawls back to the saloon, drunk and vomiting. Chris and Rebecca see him on the ground and take him inside. There, Chris asks what on earth is going on with the 3 students. Rebecca sternly tells them they will all leave at 6 the next morning. Now that it is their last night in Teardrop, Chris is unhappy. He records voice notes about his migraines and the rage he feels now that they are about to leave. Chris still has so many questions, and if he leaves now, he might not ever get to return. He goes to the hanging judge's cabin, and from outside, he sees a flood of water sloshing out of the door. He runs inside and sees a vision of Lorelai in the bathtub. Rebecca arrives at the cabin, snapping Chris out of the hallucination and revealing that it is actually Josie naked in the tub. Disgusted with her suitor, Rebecca storms off, and Chris apologizes to both women profusely. He insists that he didn't do it on purpose, and that he never touched Josie, but Rebecca doesn't believe him. She's not having any of his excuses. She walks into the saloon and asks Denver to drive her to the nearest town. Denver obliges. It's already quite dark out when they drive off. Denver stops in the middle of the road, telling his passenger that he can only take her up to this point. He is not comfortable leaving the hotel. Rebecca takes her bags and walks down the rest of the road, while Denver returns to the hotel. Back at the cabin, the students pack their things while Chris sits quietly, deep in thought. They try to talk to him, but he just tells them they all need to get some sleep. He heads to his room and leaves Ross, Josie, and Tila in the cabin. No one realizes that things are about to take a turn for the worse. Everyone heads to bed, but Tila can't sleep. She hears voices screaming and whispering, voices that are trying to speak to her, to tell her something. In a trance, she gets up, takes the rope from under her bed, and brings it outside. In the hotel room, Chris also gets up suddenly. He can't help but notice his striking resemblance with the blurry photo of Judge Wincott on his bedside drawer. Chris gets the feeling that something is wrong. Shortly after, Josie notices Tila is gone, so she wakes Ross up, and they go look for her. They all get outside their rooms and see Tila's gallows. Chris orders the other 2 to pack their things so they can leave. He rushes into the saloon and tries to call the police, but the phone in the saloon doesn't work. Chris tells Denver a student has died. Just then, the phone rings. Chris looks confused as Denver answers it. The person on the other line wants to speak with Chris. He takes the call and hears the voice of a woman he doesn't recognize. This woman says it was nice to see him, and he turned out to be very handsome. Chris asks who she is, but she only responds that he already knows who. When Chris hangs up, Denver tells him this is the same thing that happens every time. The faces are new, but everyone who stays in this town faces the same fate. Chris runs out of the saloon into the cabin. He starts to tell Josie that they need to leave immediately. But as he approaches her bed, the flashes of pain and visions of the past happen again. They are longer this time around, as if he is living through that time. He experiences visions of the judge, while in the present he suffocates Josie. A few moments later, Josie stops breathing. Chris backs away from the bed in shock, realizing what he has done. Meanwhile, Ross sees the maid outside and urges her to leave Teardrop with them. But the maid doesn't follow, and instead tells Ross to come with her. She leads him to a pitch-black area near the barn, and tells Ross to lift his lantern to look at her. The maid has shifted into a man, and says he can be whoever he wants to be. A moment later, she returns back to female form, and a large crowd of ghosts appear behind her. She tells Ross that they were all victims of public hanging, humiliated as the people in town watched. Ross calls her a freak, and then hears hounds growling. The hounds attack Ross and end his life. Chris stands at the hotel entrance, hands shaking. As he stares at the portrait of Alice and Lorelai, Their ghosts appear before him. He gets more visions of the past. Panicked, he goes outside to look for Ross and Rebecca. When he bumps into Denver, Denver reminds Chris of the warning he gave on their very first day. That teardrop should only be a pit stop. A suitcase rolls onto the road. It's Rebecca's. Chris takes the suitcase and unzips it to find Rebecca's lifeless body inside. He turns around to blame Denver, who in the head without hesitation. Chris has no idea why this is all happening. He's helpless. At this point, he's the only one in their original group who is still alive. Just when he thinks he's alone, Chris hears a creaking noise. Someone is sitting on the rocking chair outside the hotel. He approaches the rocking chair to see who it is. The man turns to look at him, and it's the judge. He looks exactly like Chris. The judge nods at Chris with a knowing smile. And Alice and Lorelai appear down the road with a rope in their hands. Chris tears up. He realizes his fate. He steps onto the gallows holding the rope. He slips the noose on himself as Alice and Lorelai stare. Chris in the saloon, Chris's typewriter and his usual drink remain on one of the tables. But now, a scarecrow sits where Chris used to.